Today we're going to be talking about what's that, dearie? Oh, it's okay to say sex on YouTube? Oh, well, in that case, sex and the Constitution. I'm Godless Granny. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome to my final installment, Birth of a Myth 4, based on Andrew Seidel's book, Founding Myth. Next week, I'm going to be taking a week off. My youngest child is a student at Auburn, War Eagle, and we'll be home on spring break, and so I'm going to take a week off to enjoy some time with her. But after that, I will be back, and we'll continue with more atheist content. Next week, I will be appearing on the Daily Atheist on Tuesday morning. My daughter is going to be joining me to give me a little support and help there. The Daily Atheist is a live broadcast that is put out at 7 a.m. my time. That's 8 a.m. on the East Coast. Sorry, it's 5 a.m. on the West Coast. But if you have a chance, please join us for that show. If you do enjoy this content, please subscribe and hit that like button. Thank you very much. A viewer has graciously responded to the wish list that I posted and has provided me with a teleprompter. And I thank you very much for that. That is very encouraging. And unfortunately, the teleprompter is not here yet, even though it has been ordered. I'm actually filming this on Tuesday. I'm getting a little bit better at what I'm doing here, but it does still take me 3 days to put together a video. And so I usually write my scripts on Monday, film on Tuesday, edit on Wednesday, publish to my patrons on Thursday, and then publish to the public on Friday. So the teleprompter won't get here until probably Friday. Next time I film, I should be having fewer jump cuts because I won't be having to look down at my notes all the time. So without further ado, let's finish up Founding Myth. We're starting in with the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And this is one area that Christian nationalists can claim that our law was based on Judeo-Christian values, because it was. The laws that our nation has had against sex have been based on Judeo-Christian ideas. But this is not to their credit, but rather to their shame. The laws that we've had in our country against sex have been discriminatory, arbitrarily enforced, and sometimes just downright ridiculous. For example, in Maryland, oral sex was outlawed as being unnatural. Michigan still has adultery as a crime listed on their books, even though it's not enforced. Until 1967, mixed relations between the races was outlawed. Now this one I found especially interesting because just this morning on Twitter, Answers in Genesis posted an article saying that God created all of the races, and so there isn't really different races, that we're really all one people. And they use that as an explanation of why, even though the author of this article and his wife had adopted a Chinese girl, that she was really not a different race than they were, that all humans are one race. And yet, just 60 years ago, it was illegal to marry someone of a different race than you were. Preachers in the pulpits were saying that God intended for the races to be separate. How did we change our ideas so much on race relations based on a Bible that's supposed to be unchanging? The Christian nationalists are right. These laws are based on the Bible, and the Bible clearly got it wrong. When he was governor, Mike Pence wanted to make adultery a crime in Indiana again. Interestingly, the prohibition of adultery by biblical standards was applied primarily to women. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, adultery was a married woman sleeping with a man who wasn't her husband. A man was guilty of adultery only if he slept with a married woman, and that's why Moses, Jacob, Solomon, David, Gideon, and Abraham were not adulterers even though they slept with women who were not their wives. It was illegal for a woman to sleep with a man who wasn't her husband, but a man was only prohibited from sleeping with another man's wife, because after all, women were the property of their husbands. Jesus expanded the idea of adultery as including not just the act of sex, but even the thought of it. He said that anyone who looks at a woman with lust in his heart has committed adultery already.
Hello friends, today I would like to talk with you about the lust.
But the prohibition here was not so much trying to control sexual behavior as trying to control loyalty. The attempt was to kill the loving relationship created by sex and instead focus all of that love on a Savior who's going to save you from your misdeeds by having bad thoughts. This is reiterated by the Catholic Church in Canon 277, which prohibits priests from having sex. It says, sacred ministers can adhere more easily to Christ with an undivided heart. The forbidding of sex is intended to promote loyalty to God and God alone. The prohibition against homosexuality is also grounded in the Bible, and for many years the law of the land in this country was that homosexuality was illegal. In 1986, in the case Bowers v. Hardwick, Chief Justice Warren upheld the idea that homosexuality could be outlawed. In his decision, he said, "Decisions of individuals relating to homosexual conduct have been subject to state intervention throughout the history of Western civilization. Condemnation of those practices is firmly rooted in Judeo-Christian moral and ethical standards." In 2003, in Lawrence v. Texas, the Bowers decision was overturned. The Supreme Court recognized that the Bowers decision's basis in Judeo-Christian principles was accurate, but legally wrong. It concluded, "The issue is whether the majority may use the power of the state to enforce its religious beliefs on the whole society through the operation of criminal law. Bowers was not correct when it was decided, and it is not correct today. Bowers v. Hardwick should be and is now overruled." And thus, homosexuality laws were struck down because the only basis they had was a religious basis, because consensual sex between two adults should not be illegal. The only basis that I have ever heard anyone argue for it is a religious basis, and we do not enforce our religious beliefs on unbelievers. When I was a Christian, I didn't feel that my religious beliefs should be enforced on unbelievers. Why would I expect an unbeliever to act as if he was a believer? If you really think that someone else should act that way, then convince them that your God is right. In 2013, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which was an attempt to ban gay marriage. The Supreme Court struck this down in the case of U.S. v. Windsor. In its opinion, the court recognized that the House of Representatives in the Defense of Marriage Act had intended to express, quote, "both moral disapproval of homosexuality and a moral conviction that heterosexuality better comports with traditional, especially Judeo-Christian morality," a sentiment that was correctly struck from our laws. From this, Seidel concludes, "Even this influence proves the larger point of this book. Judeo-Christianity's influence leads to unconstitutional laws that courts are forced to strike down because Judeo-Christian principles conflict with the higher principles of our Constitution. Or, as Justice Blackmun said in his dissent in Bowers, a state can no more punish private behavior because of religious intolerance than it can punish such behavior because of racial animus. The American government can't punish citizens for violating religious laws. Seidel doesn't cover this issue in his book, but more recently we've also got transgender issues. All of the bathroom laws that some people are proposing to try to prevent transgender people from using the restroom of their choice. And they come down to the most ridiculous results. You almost feel like you have to carry a birth certificate with you just to use the bathroom so you can prove which gender you were on your birth certificate. Come on, people. Just let people use whatever bathroom they want to. Does it really make that much of a difference? Now, there is another issue that does get much more difficult, and that is prison housing. I have seen some articles where some people say that people are claiming to be transgender so that they can be housed with the opposite sex in a prison. And determining whether a person is really transgender or just making that claim for some other purposes, that's a much more difficult issue, and I do not have the answers on that. And it will be decided by greater minds than mine. Next, we come to the 10th commandment. And Vampire Yahweh, I chose this version of the 10th commandment just for you. You shall not covet thy neighbor's house. You shall not covet thy neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or ass, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. The first problem with this being a basis in U.S. law is that it is a thought crime, and the First Amendment clearly prohibits thought crime, coveting, thinking that you want something that belongs to someone else. Trying to enforce a thought crime is not only difficult, but when it is done, it is a sign of a totalitarian regime. So no, the 10th commandment definitely does not bring thought crime into our law. The second problem with the 10th commandment is seeing women as property. The neighbor's wife is clearly listed as being among his property, just like his ox and his ass. Abigail Adams famously asked her husband when the Declaration was being drafted, I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Unfortunately, our founding fathers did not remember the ladies, and maybe there was a touch of the 10th commandment in there, I don't know. But eventually we did realize that we got this one wrong. Not allowing women to vote was primarily based on the idea that women were only going to vote for whoever their husbands told them to, and so by allowing women to vote, it just meant that married men got 2 votes instead of 1. As if women didn't have minds of their own. The biblical view of women said that women were subject to their husbands. The unfair treatment of women in the Bible is also seen through the area of barrenness. In the Bible, whenever a couple is childless, it's always seen as the woman's fault. It always lists the woman as being barren, and yet science today tells us that 30 to 50% of the time when a couple is childless, it's because of male infertility. And then, when the woman does conceive, Yahweh gets the credit. The patriarch, Yahweh, gets the credit, but women get the blame. Further signs of inequality in the Bible is that sons are holy to the Lord, but daughters are not. Until fairly recently, there were lots of laws in our books that were discriminatory against women. The movie On the Basis of Sex shows the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her early years in legal practice, arguing before the Supreme Court. The case they brought before the court was actually just a tax law, and they were actually arguing in favor of a man not being discriminated by this tax law, because trying to bring up the case as to the discrimination against women would be much more difficult. And Ginsburg was urged not to bring up the entire issue of sexual discrimination, but to keep her focus very limited. She disregarded them, and much of the resistance that she got was because discrimination against women was so entrenched in our law that if the court decided that discrimination on the basis of sex was illegal, we had to change so much of our law. But the time was right, and the decision was correct, and finally, we are getting closer to women having equal rights in this country. Our current administration would like to see us turn back the clock. In a 1994 interview, Trump said,
"I think that putting a wife to work is a very dangerous thing. I really don't want that." And a softness disappeared. But when I come home and dinner's not ready, I go through the roof.
Mike Pence said that using daycare, which is to say leaving the home to work, would stunt a child's emotional growth and make the child less affectionate toward its mother. We also see discrimination against women in reproductive rights. We are once again facing abominable laws that would make abortion illegal. I covered the issue of abortion in a 2-part series called What is a Baby? I'm not going to go over that in detail again, but needless to say that the entire purpose of reproductive rights laws isn't really to protect embryos and fetuses, but to keep women supposedly in their place. The 10th commandment is an example of why our law is based on Judeo-Christian principles is actually a problem for Christian nationalists. American capitalism and our consumer society would be destroyed if we enforced the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment is most definitely un-American. Christian nationalists would tell you that our laws are based on the morals of the 10 Commandments, but the 10 Commandments really are not a moral code, but a religious code. The primary purpose of the 10 Commandments isn't to teach us how to behave and how to be good to one another, but the primary purpose is to perpetuate the faith. You can see that by the fact that the first 5 of them are all about making sure that you are worshiping the correct God. The morals of people today are far better than they were of people at the time that the Bible was written. Deuteronomy 13:6-11 tells us quite clearly that you should kill anyone, especially a family member, that would entice you to worship another god. Most believers today are more moral than their God. This is alarming because it means that preachers are claiming divine sanction on their own personal moral judgments, in stating that their judgment is divine judgment. As Seidel states, the United States is founded on ideals that are far more important, impressive, and timeless than anything Judeo-Christianity can offer. Christian nationalists also make argument from idiom as to show why our country is based on religious ideas. For example, the presidential oath ending in "So help me God." Washington Irving made the claim that George Washington added this to the end of the presidential oath. However, there is no evidence of this other than his statement. Irving was 6 years old at the time of Washington's inauguration, and he was there. However, when he states where he was located, it is extremely unlikely that he could have heard him. Not only that, those who recorded the event recorded no such thing. And so this one account from a small child is unlikely to be accurate. Rather, the words "So help me God" were added to public administering of the oath. It was done by Woodrow Wilson. He had already taken the oath of office in private, but when he redid it in public, he added the words "So help me God." Those who were present at the private administration say that that wording was not included. And since the public inclusion of it, it's been done much more often. And once religion was found to be a political weapon used primarily by Reagan, it's been used ever since. And so we see the words "So help me God" being added to the presidential oath, even though they are not there in the Constitution, and they weren't there in the early history of our country. Someone recently said that anyone who thinks that we weren't founded as a Christian nation needed only to have the founding fathers look at the coins in their pockets and see the words "In God we trust" on them. No, there wasn't any money minted by the United States at the time that the founders were writing the Constitution. And the words "In God we trust" were not added to our money until 1863. and "In God We Trust" did not become our national motto until 1956. There was a lot of religion that was added to our country in the 1950s because of the Red Scare. Because communism was seen as equated with atheism, we needed to show that Americans were different, and this is when Christian and American became synonymous. Not because of anything that happened in our historical founding, but because of a differentiation between us and the communists. The words "under God" were not added to our Pledge of Allegiance until this period as well. It was added in 1954. I foresee that these words will be removed once again from the Pledge of Allegiance, as this is being brought up as an issue, particularly for school children that are asked to say this pledge, regardless of what deity, if any, they believe in. As the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said in 2002, in the context of the pledge, the statement that the United States is a nation under God is not a mere acknowledgement that many Americans believe in a deity. To recite the pledge is not to describe the United States. Instead, it is to swear allegiance to the values for which the flag stands: unity, indivisibility, liberty, justice, and, since 1954, monotheism. The text of the official pledge, codified in federal law, impermissibly takes a position with respect to the purely religious question of the existence of God. The Supreme Court of the United States denied cert to review this case because of a lack of standing on the part of the father that brought the case. But it's probably only a matter of time before this eventually does get to the Supreme Court. Our political leaders ending most speeches with "God bless America" came about as a result of Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Nobody did that before Nixon, and yet now it's become a very common thing to do. It is time to once again reclaim our heritage, or as Thomas Jefferson said, "It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself." The truth is that our government is not founded on Judeo-Christian values. It is not founded on Judeo-Christian morality. It is not founded on the Ten Commandments. We are a secular government. You are free to practice any religion that you like. And I certainly don't wish to infringe upon the religious freedoms of anyone who might be watching this. But in the practice of your religion, don't force me to practice it too. Don't try to force your religious ideas on me. And yes, our society does have to determine as a group what is right and what is wrong. And your religious ideas will help found what you decide is right and wrong. But it isn't a determination of what is right and wrong for the group as a whole. Finally, I'd like to conclude with another quote from Seidel's book. Christian nationalists have successfully persuaded too many Americans to abandon our heritage, to spurn our secular foundations in favor of their myth. It is time to reclaim that heritage and refute these myths. We need to remind Americans that our Constitution demands an absolute separation between church and state. As John Kennedy said, we must raise hell when the wall of separation between state and church is breached. We must, as Madison warned, take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you back again in 2 weeks, and until then, live your life.